Panopticon by Scott Miller. Truth be told, I'd known cattle trucks less cold and uninviting. Come to think of it, I'd known them to be altogether more roadworthy too. The only feature held in common between those mobile slaughterhouses and the single-decker bus that ferried us through that endless stretch of dark mountain road was that they were equally ill-suited to transporting human livestock. More shattered hull or bus-like thing than fully-fledged coach or van, it appeared to have either been designed or stripped to suit a singular purpose. Expedient transportation, whatever the cost to its living cargo. I turned my head as far as my restraints would allow, past the downturned faces of my fellow condemned and beyond, as far back into the main compartment as the dirty blues and greens of the dashboard would avail my bloodshot eyes. In the forgotten prime of its wretched life, I imagine it had been furnished with 2 tidy columns of colourful high-backed chairs, fit for ferrying eagle-eyed tourists or families vacationing at one of the area's many idyllic ports. But no longer. They now shared more in common with medieval torture devices than comforting items of furniture, and stood gutted of all upholstery, their plush innards wrenched out and metal skeletons exposed, out of which rusty nails jutted with cruel intent. Some had been removed entirely from their rows, metal fastenings and all, extracted like so many rotten teeth from bleeding gums. Not wanting to risk injury and infection, the more sensible among us, and I didn't count myself among their number, had taken to sitting on the floor. No longer an aisle, but a dirty crawl space between what remained of either column of chairs. I swatted weakly at what I took to be a rogue insect orbiting my newly shaved head, and peered up to follow through with another swipe of my shackled hands. Dangling inches above my head swung a tangle of wires that trailed like bundled intestines from hollowed-out television units. Beyond the empty frames, in the drafty upper compartment of the bus-like thing, a makeshift roof of leaky canvas flapped its damp, leathery wings as if it meant to carry the bus skyward on some monstrous voyage. And it was my ready wish that it would. Anything to bring the noise to an abrupt end. I'd settle for wholly unimaginative ends, however. The driver was no doubt as sullen and agitated as the rest of the chattel at this point. He wasn't much associated with this cross-country trek of ours, and had likely been paid a pittance for his part in the voyage, vital though it was. I wondered whether, perhaps, in his exhaustion and impatience, he'd grow a little more daring. Perhaps he'd take a hairpin turn at speed, causing us to topple and slide across the tarmac, reducing the bus to a smoking, road-scorched ruin. Or perhaps we'd exit a blind rise at pace and slam into a cow as it strayed into our path, the bus's occupants reduced to paste from the force of the impact. Better yet, he might overshoot an all-important exit that if missed would lead us along some god-forsaken path of ultimate circuity, responding instead by ramming the wretched machine into the steel barricades that hemmed us in, sending us careering over the edge and into some watery abyss far, far below. All within the realm of possibility for this screaming bucket of bolts, and each as tantalizing as the last. I closed my eyes and held my breath, urging one of the assorted fantasies, my dread musings, to come true. Instead, the bus putted along without incident, even gracefully, and the droning only seemed to intensify with every mile. I muttered a curse under my breath. I couldn't risk attracting unwanted attention. I couldn't allow myself to show weakness, not now, and not for some time to come. Such was the depth of my discomfort that it felt like someone was scraping my vital organs with crumpled balls of tinfoil, but so vigorously as to suggest they were trying to lift a stain from a wine-soaked carpet. At its ear-aching zenith, every sound seemed to coalesce into one dry, discordant note in endless crescendo, and I couldn't do anything about it. On the contrary, I had nothing short of a front-row seat to this disharmonious symphony for idiots. This recital of soundscapes, both inhuman and inhumane, played by a cohort of stuttering animatronic dummies. If I'd been watching from the gods, I'd have at least been able to blend with the shadows of a half-empty gallery. I could have quit the curtain call that never seemed to come, bolting freely over the seats of no-shows, latecomers and stowaways, and raced toward the soft green luminescence of the balcony's emergency exit. But I found myself overexposed, and unable to move at the throbbing center of a capacity crowd, a veritable royal circle of hell. Looking around, the others seemed unperturbed by the noise. On occasion, they even applauded loudly from where they sat, some seeing fit to rise to their feet in full expression of their adulation. Their clapping put me ill at ease, having been delivered in seemingly random intervals that would usually betoken some progression or sequence, some change in the structure of the pitiless churning noise, where there was in fact none to be found. I couldn't bear one more bar, and attempted to stand up, only to be yanked backward by something drawn tight about my waist, cutting into my underbelly. I ran my hands along it, a thick band of polyester, not unlike a seatbelt. What use is a goddamn seatbelt in a theatre? Half crazed, I fumbled in the dark for the catch or clasp, tracing the length of the band to its terminal point, but found no such thing. Suddenly, I felt them. A myriad eyes boring into the back of my skull. I froze in place, crossed my legs, and brought my interwoven fingers to a rest on my lap. After a moment, I felt their eyes drift from me, shapes turning slowly in my peripheral vision, and resolved to try again after a brief intermission. In the fray, I'd managed to tune out the harshest frequencies, and they now returned with tinnitus-inducing vengeance. Under the duress of sustained performance, the instrumentalists had begun to show signs of malfunction. As the spectacle wore on, precious fluid leaked from snapped cabling, collecting in inky puddles on the floor. Faulty wiring spat streaks of golden sparks across the stage. They registered in those pitch-black pools as miniature meteor showers in multiple night skies. Thin tendrils of smoke snaked out from between grease-smeared plastic paneling, leaving the theatre slightly perfumed. In the impromptu pyrotechnics, the other patrons found no cause for alarm. Rather, they rushed to their feet in standing ovation. To all appearances, it was part of the show. That's my cue, I thought to myself, and wrenched back the taut waistband, slipping it over my legs in one fluid motion. I rose weakly to my feet, before stumbling back a bit. It felt like I hadn't stretched my legs in years, as if the muscle had all but atrophied from disuse. I resolved to hobble my way to freedom, if that's what it took. But before I could take my first tentative steps, invisible hands sprung out from behind me and dragged me yelping back toward my seat. Before I could blink, multiple arms curled around my waist, and some were hastily slung across my throat to brace me. Manic in their grip, I convulsed with animal rage, screaming, spitting, biting, howling for help. Even amid my panicked yelps, the other theatergoers refused to tear their eyes from the stage, in the throes of some unbreakable spell. On the stage, the sputtering machines could no better hold on to their lifeblood than a sieve conceivably could water, and oil continued to spray in long black loops from unseen wounds. I tugged at, then shook the person sitting beside me with my flailing free hand. I wouldn't be ignored, surely. And I wasn't. Whatever they were wearing felt cheap and synthetic, and the body beneath slim and cold. I snatched my hand away as the downturned figure made to turn toward me, regretting immediately my decision. Propelled by a rudimentary motor, the figure's head slowly rotated on the static base of its neck. It stared at me, through and beyond me, with daydreamily large eyes that shone like precious stones. Its full-lipped mouth was upturned in an obliging smile, and its skin was ghostly pale and reflective. No, not a person at all, but a doll. It shifted closer, until we were inches apart, and drew a glossy finger to its chipped lips in silent remonstration. Its free hand recoiled in a striking position, and my lips parted once more in a quavering scream as it thrust its cold digits into my mouth and down my trembling throat. Like coiling vipers, more limbs slithered across my torso, pulling me tighter into their embrace. Then down into the seams of the chair, into the very bowels of the earth. The music reduced to a faint whimpering, and the theatre lurched forward with a sudden and violent thrust. Floorboards splintered and shot skyward, chandeliers plummeted to their doom, and sculpted decorations broke free of their supports, clattering to the floor. After the initial shockwave, the entire structure teetered back and forth until finally settling with a seismic groan. I briefly came to in the dirty aisle, surrounded by heaped forms, their bodies limp and expressions awestruck. I gasped for air, but every breath was a noxious fume, warm and bitter on the tongue. Though my ears still rang, a silence unlike anything I'd ever known had fallen upon the place. Dragging myself from the floor, I came to a rest on my knees and cast a furtive eye around, taking in the full extent of the damage. A colossal grease fire had bloomed into existence center stage. Well, whatever was left thereof. And the auditorium was bathed in shuddering incandescent light, forcing me to clasp a sooty hand to my brow. Acrid columns of smoke belched forth, throwing shadows like giants across the ever-blackening walls. Breathlessness soon gave way to nausea, and I felt something slick and warm travel upward within me. It jettisoned itself through my covered mouth, dripping between my fingers and down my throat, and in the silent enfolding darkness, I collapsed once more. I awoke in a world of brilliant, blinding white. I shut tight my eyes, purple blemishes writhing in the black, and opened them once more. The sun beat a hasty retreat to the horizon, ushering in the half-light and bringing into view the face of a man who looked a couple years my senior. He wore clothing unlike my own, a navy blue cotton shirt, tan pants, and polished black shoes. A quivering crown of gel-stiffened hair sat upon his forehead, and yellow chevrons capped his shoulders. "Ah, Sleeping Beauty wakes at last. Thanks for joining us," he said, thumbing off his flashlight. His accent struck me as odd, the way he'd flatten his A's to A's and spit his U's. I'd never heard it before, but it set my teeth on edge. I surmised from very limited data that he must have been a local. Gazing out the window, I was surprised to find that the bus had come to a complete standstill on the side of the road. Thankfully, so had the noise. Outside, little had changed, and an unforthcoming landscape of panoramic black stared back at me. "Cool, eh? Anybody home?" he asked, snapping his fingers inches from my face. "Where are we?" I mumbled at last. "And what is that smell?" "I'm not sure where we are exactly, but you..." He tapped my head with the butt of his flashlight. "You're in deep shit." I swallowed hard, wincing as I did so. My throat was raw, like I'd swallowed razor blades in my sleep. "As for the smell, that'll be your handiwork on the floor over there, my friend," he said, gesturing with the black tube. I followed a trail of greenish-yellow slime from the front of my shirt down to my slick hands and beyond, to where it collected in a quivering puddle of vomit on the ground, growing ever larger with every drop that fell from the seat in front of me. Minestrone soup, my last meal before I boarded the bus. Mortified, I buried my face in my hands. Well, not quite. That was when I first noticed the thick leather belt that had been used to restrain me. "That's mine, so don't go running off with it if you get bored," he said, chuckling to himself. "It's just as effective for whipping." I felt a muscle in my jaw twitch. "And while I've got your attention, newbie," he continued, "the warden will be wanting a word with you once you've been processed." He smiled and licked his lips, relishing the thought. "Newbie," I repeated. "That's not my..." "No, my humble apologies. How about piss pants?" "Well, No? What about nutcase?" "No, wait. How about colossal pain in my arse? That's a strong contender." At that, a ripple of laughter spread out around me. My eyes darkened, and I said nothing. "Oh, did I say something funny?" spat the man, and a beam of torchlight pierced the darkness, darting from face to face. "I'm trying to have a private conversation with newbie over here," he said after a moment. "Talk quietly amongst yourselves, or not at all." Satisfied, he turned back to me and said, "Give it time, newbie," punching me lightly on the shoulder. "It'll grow on you." "Wait," I said, slowly clicking. "Piss pants." The doors to the bus wheezed open with a distinct sucking sound, promptly banishing any warmth, and a grubby hand began to snake its way upward along the railing, coming closer with every footfall. At the top of the stairs, the man let out an exasperated sigh as he stared down at his hands. Cursing, he removed his duck-billed hat and swabbed first his glistening dome, then his hands, with an old rag. He stuffed the grease-smeared rag into the lining of his jacket and peered down the aisle. "Officer Bell!" he called out. Officer Bell twisted his body round, keys jingling from his belt, and raised a hand in recognition. Turning to me with a smirk, he said, "You'll figure it out, I'm sure." He spun on his heels and strutted toward the driver, swinging his flashlight as he went, and the two began to converse in a language I didn't understand. After a moment, they padded down the steps to the passenger exit, and later reappeared behind a thick perspex wall up front. The engine coughed and rattled, then shuddered as we took off at breakneck speed from the gravel path that had become our temporary roadside locale, leaving a mushroom cloud of exhaust fumes in our wake. Loose stones rebounded off the undercarriage like stray gunfire before dying away completely beneath the familiar, all-consuming dirge. "Piss pants," I muttered out loud, and stared into my lap. Several others peered over my shoulder, and peals of laughter erupted around me. I wanted the earth to swallow me whole. I rubbed sleep from my tired, swollen eyes. How I'd managed rest at all, fitful though it was, remains a mystery to me. I peered out the window, somehow expecting to see something different. A vague silhouette stared back as the glass misted over with my breath, like a smear on a projector. I probably looked like hell, and I undoubtedly felt it. A jolt of warmth and pain unfurled across my shoulders as I craned my head for a better look, and a dry rasp escaped my lips. Unable to recline, my back had turned into a distended mess of knots and bruised vertebrae overnight. My regards to Officer Bell, and my backside had become a warm slab of unfeeling meat beneath me. I tugged in vain at the brace about my shoulders and wriggled warmth and sensation back into my extremities. I looked about, desperate for a modicum of distraction. I dare not stir up conversation with the other inmates. I'd given them more than enough to talk about. I much preferred when they briefly feared and avoided me, but they now had ample reason to hamstring any conversation with mockery, and I wasn't about to give them the pleasure. Besides, they all seemed to be getting along marvelously with one another. Directly across from me, I spied a figure that lay slumped over on his side, a thread of snot glistening from flaring nostril to drooling mouth. His right eye was a weeping, discolored bulge. Even if his face had been pulverized the night before, he looked an oddly tranquil picture, like a babe in arms. Whatever he did to deserve that china, I'd do the same with pleasure if it meant I could recoup a couple hours of rest. Perhaps it was worthwhile mingling after all. The figure to his right, a hulking brute of a man, and no doubt the one responsible, slept with his muscled arms folded beneath his chin. He cut an impressive figure, even in repose, but I couldn't help but notice how at odds his bulk was with the rest of his apparel. His clothes were much too shrunken and tight, and his manacles looked like mine, but in miniature, as if they could be snapped at a moment's notice. I stifled a snort at this, and he grumbled awake, raising a brow in my direction. I jerked my head round to face the windows once more. Perfect. "You!" he grunted, leveling an accusing finger at me. I looked about frantically, as if trying to discern the source of the challenge. "Me?" I asked, pointing to myself as I turned to face him, an expression of mock bemusement on my face.
"Looking to piss yourself again, newbie?"
he said, his lips parting in a roguish smile. I was about to respond with something suitably inflammatory when I was reminded of my run-in with Officer Bell and of my looming date with the warden. I had to change tack. And fast. "Oh no, I was just admiring your handiwork is all," gesturing bodily to the figure at rest beside him. He squirmed up straight in his seat, rolling his burly shoulders before raising a clenched fist at me.
"Care to join him?"
"More than you know," I thought. "Not at all," I said instead, lifting my hands in a gesture of diplomacy and sinking low in my chair. He eased off with a snort, his folded arms coming to a rest beneath his chin once more and his eyes rolling back in his skull. "Tell me," I began, spinning round in my seat after briefly cursing my stupidity. His chest heaved with exasperation, and he regarded me with one lidless, demonic eyeball. "It's just—" I laughed nervously. "You've seen your fair share of action, right?" He stared blankly at me, growing more impatient by the second. "Fights," I said after clearing my throat. "Been in a couple scraps?" He took a brief moment to admire his own physique, as if to say, "No shit." "A rhetorical question. Never mind," I said with a wave of my hand, shooing away the thought.
"Oh, what?"
he replied, his rage mounting. My breath came in short, sharp rasps. What I mean is, have you ever had a run-in with the warden?" I said, finally blurting out what I intended to say.
"Let me give you a piece of advice, newbie. Usually I wouldn't, but that big mouth of yours is going to get you in trouble. Don't piss off the warden."
I gulped hard. Too late, I mused.
"The warden knows what's best for us,"
he continued.
"Don't argue or talk back, and don't try to bargain with him. In fact, keep your trap shut, if you can help it, understand? Else you might end up like my friend over here, or worse."
He stroked gingerly the unconscious passenger's cheek with the back of his hand, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine.
"Now,"
he said, folding his enormous arms once more.
"Shut up."
With that, he promptly fell asleep. A faint glimmer of amber light caught my eye as it rose above the black lip of the horizon, hinting at the surrounds as it darted between trees and rocks, before disappearing altogether behind shrouded monoliths of rock that formed the craggy perimeter of the valley beyond. We were close then, but I resolved to not get my hopes up. It could have been anything, I decided, and listed off a number of possible suggestions, each of them as unlikely as the last. I allowed myself the small indulgence that it may have been dawn's breaking. I didn't think I'd ever see the sun again, or feel its warmth. That might serve to make the trip worthwhile, or at least a little more bearable. And in any case, my moon-bleached skin could have done with a little color. Just when I had begun, in my own way, to warm to the aimless arrow, a nickname of my own devising for the broken workhorse of this preposterous odyssey, it pitched up sharply, rearing on mechanical haunches, and threatened to fall back on itself. We'd begun to ascend diagonally through low cloud and squalls of rain. Like so many pebbles and beans in a slanted rainstick, empty bottles and duffel bags began to slide and topple backward, collecting in the rear of the bus. None of my valuables were among them. I was told that everything would be provided for me, and that I should travel light and only pack essentials. Milky wisps curled past my window, moments later giving way to a dense blanket of impenetrable fog. It looked like my window had been tuned to a dead channel. For a brief moment, the subterranean thrum of the engine died away entirely as the driver tussled with the stick shift. I smiled impishly as we began to creep back. To my grave disappointment, however, the frenzied grinding soon gave way to the high-pitched whine of the lowest possible gear. The driver risked nothing, opting to crawl inch by sordid inch through the thick cloud column. We travelled in this painstaking and lopsided manner for a time, and tentatively judged the camber of the road by the faint glow of the cat's eyes with which it was lined. As we wound our mazy way through the fog, the bus began to level out, and an assortment of valuables slid back toward the centre. Soon enough, the mists parted, and I found myself staring into a desolate valley hemmed in on all sides by jagged mountains and steep hillocks. From my vantage, it looked more like an enormous impact crater. A halo of lights throbbed at its core, nestled in the veil like a dull coin, floating amid the scum of a time-forgotten well. Over the intercom, a voice like cold, cackling static announced,
"Next stop, Old Andrea, and the town of New Eden."
We began our descent, and the bus tilted once more, personal belongings and sundry following suit. We tore down the mountain pass at pace, the driver so smitten with the thought that we'd finally reach our destination that he'd forgotten to temper our rapid approach. New Eden, he'd said. That couldn't be right, I thought as we broke through the city limits. I had seen this town once before. In the glossy pages of cheap magazines bloated with fad diets and celebrity scandal, I'd seen it. Under the hiss of fluorescent tubing that blurs the distinction between hospital and supermarket, I had seen it. Between the blistered creases of pamphlets wedged stubbornly between wiper and shield, I had seen it. And now, through passenger windows freckled from countless sojourns through rain-spattered darkness, yes, I had seen this town once before. However, I didn't recall any mention of a New Eden, but I knew its history well. I had indeed seen this place before, but I'd known it by a different name altogether, and a well-deserved one at that. Lapsus. We stuck to the main thoroughfares of the town's fringes, and didn't deviate from the well-worn roads until we'd reached the gates of Old Andrea. I thought the driver may have been afflicted by a flight of superstition, but was later informed that the city's buildings were structurally unsound, and had developed the nasty and unpredictable habit of toppling over, flattening anyone or anything unfortunate enough to be within crushing distance. As a result, it was best to steer clear of the city's ever-changing topology. We came to an abrupt halt in front of a wire ring gate, bookended by a towering fence of similar construction and topped with barbed wire. A security guard carrying an automatic rifle hastily stubbed out a cigarette beneath the heel of his boot before striding toward the driver's side window. He circled the vehicle once, and a clipboard quickly exchanged hands. He gazed blankly at it, as someone might a perplexing mathematical equation, and left his answer at the bottom. He would have signed off on anything this early in the morning. Satisfied, he let his gun hang freely in its sling and manually rolled back the gate, waving us through with 2 fingers. We passed through several more checkpoints, each one more heavily guarded than the last, until we were encircled by concrete watchtowers of hawk-eyed guardsmen. They trained their weapons on the rear of the bus, illuminated by spotlights. Once the gate had closed behind us, and we'd come to a halt, a familiar face mounted the steps, and a few others I didn't recognize descended on us, each tapping batons against their palms. "Time to go, ladies," said Officer Bell, as he climbed aboard and began walking the length of the passenger compartment. He traded in his signature flashlight for a sleek electroshock weapon, and bade us rise with the snap and crackle of arcing bolts. Having already tasted its sting, I wouldn't be told twice. The few inmates who still slept were pulled barely conscious to their feet, slapped on the cheek like newborns, and funneled into the aisle. The doors to the back were wrenched open, and the guards set about extending a flimsy platform from a hollow beneath the metal-plated floor. Under the watchful eye of Officer Bell, we began shuffling bandy-legged toward the ramp, our chains clinking together and scraping along its length as we began disembarking. I gave the other inmates as wide a berth as I could manage under the circumstances, and resolved to exit last. As I crunched down on gravel and hobbled toward the others, Officer Bell sealed the rear exit and thumped the hull twice, giving the driver the all clear. The aimless arrow performed a sluggish 3-point turn before speeding toward the exit, kicking up clouds of dust as it passed us. I dug my face into my forearm to shield my mouth and eyes from the gust of grit, and once the dust had settled, cast my gaze about. I found that we disembarked in a yard lit by pitiless floodlights, and had huddled together in amongst small mounds of dark grey slate and bone-white chalk scree. It was one of the city's abandoned quarries, I surmised. The bus's hasty getaway had revealed the remains of an iron-shod railway half buried in the ash and powder beneath our feet, and I followed its serpentine path as far as the light permitted. I didn't dare step a foot out of place.
Line up!
Bellowed Officer Bell, pulling me out of my reverie, and a shabby row of prisoners soon formed.
Closer!
He demanded, and he and the other guards began jostling us into position.
No, you idiots!
He said, shaking his head in frustration.
Like this!
He gripped my shoulder and drove my head squarely into the small of another prisoner's back. The man whose well-muscled back I'd inadvertently nuzzled threw a dirty look over his shoulder at me, and I recognized him as the brute from the bus. Perfect.
Now hold still,
said Officer Bell, a warning loud enough for the others, but oddly personal too.
Your Highness,
he mused, catching my gaze as he knelt down to tie mine and the brute's restraints together. The other officers followed suit, and soon enough we shuffled as one, a somewhat comical conga line of convicts. As we neared the wire-rung passage that led to processing, I looked about for the half-submerged tracks I'd glimpsed earlier. I spotted them trailing into the mouth of a mine shaft, which I judged from the state of the tracks in the absence of a rolling stock to be long out of use. The longer I stared at its entrance, the more difficult it became to look away. The mine had a certain allure about it, something like nostalgia, and potent desires rose up in me, quite unbidden. I wanted to run my fingers along its perspiring walls, to explore its shadowy depths, secret hollows and cavernous recesses, to float in its rivers of subterranean slime, and its yawning mouth was ever so inviting. I came to in a small but well-appointed room, with shelves bursting with dusty tomes that canvassed every subject imaginable, from the esoteric to the natural sciences. Oil paintings hung in gilt frames on the walls, and in the shuddering light of ornate candelabra, the uncanny portraits depicted seemed to stare out at me in contempt. I was seated at a stately table of varnished mahogany. I strained my ears, detecting the faint patter of rain, then felt something warm slide down my cheek, and realized I was bleeding all over it. The last thing I'd remembered was lying on the flat of my back in the yard, a figure looming over me, then blackness, the same with which my throbbing eye was now consumed. Vest in hand, I began mopping up the gore to the best of my ability when the door creaked open, and in walked a bespectacled man of middle age.
"Oh, I wouldn't worry about that,"
he said, and sat down across from me. He seemed an eternity away. Adjusting his glasses, he licked a finger and began thumbing through a short docket. Satisfied, he set it down, and massaged his temples before bringing his clasped hands to a rest on the table.
"Let's get down to brass tacks, shall we?"
the warden began.
"You've caused me quite the headache, Mr. Morales. Over the last 36 hours, you've seen fit to engage in a full complement of behaviours most wanton,"
and began listing them off on his fingers.
"Intimidation, harassment, public indecency, violence and the threat of violence, and near constant disruption of both the law, the peace, and the bodily integrity of others, including yourself. I mean, my God," he continued. "One witness has come forward to claim that at one point during transit, you even attempted to swallow your own fist. Even more impressive is that you accomplished all of this before processing. This seems little more than a desperate plea for attention, or at worst a misguided gambit that might, under more pliant conditions, allow for either premature transfer or release."
"Quite the headache indeed," he finished, pinching his brow. "Sir, I can
Don't sir me. Don't pretend you possess the faintest regard for anyone beside yourself," he snarled. "The correctional officers certainly don't, and their job demands, in part, that they judge characters and mete out the required punishment with fairness in mind. That is a duty to which I too am sworn, and to which end I tender the following proposal."
He raised the document and cleared his throat before continuing.
"Myself, the staff, the inmates, and the Advisory Council of Old Andrea Correctional Facility have judged your behaviour to be at odds with the ethos of the system, which in its capacity to disrupt, court violence, and sow chaos is beyond our expertise and faculties to curtail. In your short time here, you've developed the sort of reputation amongst the staff and inmates that would make complete integration challenging, to put it lightly. More than it ordinarily professes a tendency to be. While we could dedicate most, if not all, available correctional officers to some manner of personal security detail, this would amount to the deployment of resources we simply cannot spare at this moment, not without putting the entire prison in jeopardy. As I see it, one of two forking paths lie ahead, neither of which will hold the prison liable. On the one hand, you can opt to spend a considerable amount of time in solitary confinement, the most expedient option. Your safety would be ensured, as would the fulfillment of your sentence, at least part thereof. On the other hand, you can serve your time in general population, which would be in keeping with the conditions of your original sentencing. You would do so at considerable risk to yourself, but would enjoy the freedoms, spatial, personal, and social, not otherwise afforded by the isolation of solitary.
He collected the bundled pages in his hands and tamped them twice before laying them neatly on the table. He produced a ballpoint pen from his shirt pocket and clicked it once, before pushing the document towards me.
The choice is yours, Mr. Morales. What will it be?
I signed my name in the appropriate area and slid the pen and paper back toward the warden, which he examined.
A wise choice.
With little time to spare, I made it back to the compound before breakfast was through, and strode into a mostly empty cafeteria. I was garbed in my standard issue jumpsuit of garish orange. I preferred to think of it as camouflage, and for a few precious hours, it fulfilled that purpose. By the time I'd arrived at the pass, I was greeted with a smell practically universal to all cafeterias. A medley of disparate but equally nauseating odours that emanated from enormous steel pots. The haggard matron responsible for this heady blend of mismatched aromas was in the process of carting them off to the back to be washed, and I squared off with her for a pitiful share of the scraps. After much hand-wringing, she deposited a steaming, discoloured mass on my tray with an audible plop. "My compliments to the chef," I said, cheerily. She merely glowered at me, wrapping her arms around the steaming cauldron and lifting it from its hot plate. Walking away, I spied a number of inmates at one of the cafeteria's many long tables, and swallowing my pride, decided to join them. A couple of them were whispering amongst themselves, mulling over the details of some clandestine matter. Upon an elevated platform toward the entrance to the mess hall was situated a small table, no bigger than a large desk. A few correctional officers were starting their day. Some ate with audible enthusiasm, some smoked, and others scanned the stretched pages of the morning's newspaper, as if the outside world were close enough to matter. Every so often, they swept the length of the hall with their gaze, and returned to their idleness when nothing noteworthy caught their attention. I leaned in, perchance to eavesdrop on the others' discreet conversation, eventually scooting closer to them when I found I couldn't hear. I managed to make out the words, "Tunnel of Love" and "Tonight," before I managed to attract some unwanted attention. "This doesn't concern you, newbie. Go sit somewhere else. This is a private party," he spat, gesturing at one of the many unoccupied tables. I shifted in my seat and started to rise when I felt two firm and authoritative hands come to rest on my shoulders. "Gentlemen, what's making headlines today?" came the voice of Officer Bell, and the others sighed and rolled their eyes in exasperation.
"Nothing, officer,"
grumbled one of the others.
"We were just talking with a new guy here about the importance of knowing your place."
He raised a contemptuous brow in my direction.
"Ah, yes,"
he said in agreement.
"The nail that sticks out gets hammered and all that."
"Exactly," replied one of the others.
"Oswald, you've been here for quite some time, yes?"
asked Officer Bell.
"One of the longest-serving inmates, actually,"
Oswald replied.
"And you weren't always popular, were you? I know for a fact that you weren't, and that even I'd had it out for you,"
he said.
"Too true."
The two chuckled.
"Well, then you'd know better than anyone here."
"How'd you even fit in?"
"Same as everyone else. You spend a night in the Tunnel of Love," came the matter-of-fact reply. I narrowed my eyes at that. "The Tunnel of Love?"
"Standard procedure, really,"
he replied.
"The idea is simple. If you'd like to earn the respect of the other prisoners, you'd like to prove you're one of us, then do as we've done and spend a night in the old mineshaft."
"You go in a boy and come out a man," one of the others chipped in.
"That's it?"
I asked.
"That's it,"
Oswald replied.
"I'll give you some time to think about it."
I'd thought about it. I'd thought of little else since I'd arrived. That morning, the guards were strangely absent from their crow's nests, and the floodlights craned their steel necks towards the compound and away from the yard. Not a soul seemed to stir in the prison, like it had been abandoned in the night. I felt that same attraction, warm and inviting, as one might recall a fond memory from one's childhood. I sensed my ankles begin to lift the longer I peered into the mine's depths. It felt somehow safe to me, isolated and quiet. "Only one night?" I asked, turning to face the lone witness. "Just one night," Oswald replied. "Not long enough." The unspoken reply rose up in me, and I simply nodded. "All the way to the bottom?" I asked instead. "As far as you can manage, I guess. Just don't get lost." "All the way down," came the response uttered inwardly, and I began walking the length of the rusted railway that led inexorably into the gloomy shaft, and didn't look back. I caressed the rough-hewn wooden beams that framed the opening and allowed me entrance. I ran my fingers along their splintered edges, their knots and twisted blemishes in heartfelt appreciation, before ducking down and passing through. Once I disappeared from sight and had begun to press deeper into the narrow corridors of wet earth, a scream began emanating from the mouth, and I clambered back on all fours to see. Something had barricaded the opening, and the whole mine began to shudder menacingly, threatening to cave in as wet earth fell in clumps around me. No, not a scream at all. A bus had reversed into the chamber's exit and began flooding it with exhaust fumes stained red from the glow of taillights.
Oswald!
I screamed.
Tell them to stop! Oswald!
The driver's side door opened, and a figure disembarked. Kneeling down beside the bus, a face materialized in the smoke.
"Just one night, Mr. Morales. One long night,"
said Oswald, and the wooden frame collapsed, muffling my screams. As panicked minutes turned to silent hours, I realized that no one was coming to my aid. Few would notice my absence, and even fewer would care, and that was a generous thought. In truth, no one would. In truth, they'd conspired to bury me alive from the very start. I was the nail that stuck out, and as soon as they'd found me unreceptive to hammering, they'd resolved to cast me aside, crooked and useless. I'd scraped and clawed at the mine's opening until dirt had lodged itself under every nail and in every pore. The more I focused my efforts on excavating myself, the tighter the corridor became. Exhausted, I sprawled out against the cool, porous rock and attempted to catch my breath. The air was thin down here, and each breath hard-won. To what end, I wasn't sure. Even if I could breathe, I couldn't slake my thirst, and there was nothing to eat. I made to get up, and my hand shot out, knocking into something cold and half-submerged. The tracks. If this was to become my tomb, I thought, I may as well fulfill what fantasies I'd harbored by exploring its depths, and I'd start with seeing where this leads. I clung to the walls of the pitch-black mine, every so often feeling for the tracks with my feet, following its winding path as it stretched deep into its cavernous depths. After some time, the corridor became much too narrow and the ceiling too low to walk upright. I adopted a hunched gait, running my hand along the rough edges of the railway as I went. It felt like I was being slowly ingested, becoming one with the damp earth that enclosed me on all sides, and I soon slid on my mud-caked stomach across the iron sleepers of the sunken trail. The tracks came to an abrupt stop at the end of a tapering, slimy tunnel, and I found that I could go no further. This was where the tracks ended, revealing nothing. A leaden slide to nowhere. I felt tears stream down my cheeks, burying my dirty face in the wet mud, and I slowly clicked. Wet! I felt the dirt give way with ease beneath my hands, and soon plunged my fingers into the moist clay beneath, pulling out fistfuls at a time. Little by little, water began to trickle through, until jets of water started to spray forth from the steadily enlarging hole. I opened my ravening mouth, eager to catch every last drop. Once I'd slaked my thirst, I continued digging, urging my waterlogged hands to continue until the waterline drew up to my neck and my body began to levitate. Taking a final breath, I propelled myself forward and through, clearing the flooded tunnel. For a moment, I was weightless, enclosed in the lukewarm water of infinite blackness. It felt almost womb-like, and I contemplated sinking to the bottom. Instead, I allowed myself to be carried upward, and eventually burst through the surface, gasping for air and squinting in the half-light. I padded through the depths until I found myself wading in the shallows, and pulled myself to the edge. I'd found myself in a dimly lit underground aquifer, beams of light piercing its pock-marked canopy of stone. Well, I was in no danger of dying of thirst, I thought, and once more collapsed on my back. I winced as I hit my head on something hard. Rubbing my cranium, I turned over, and found myself staring at a ruddy brown shoe. It was that of a child's. Its weight felt uneven in my hands, My breath caught in my throat, and I let it fall to the floor. A length of bone was lodged in the shoe. I gazed about with narrowed eyes, still adapting to the presence of light, and, to my horror, discovered a heap of lifeless bodies strewn about the pond. Some bobbed with their faces downturned in the shallows, their skin prune-like and distended from prolonged exposure. Others languished on the edge, their rotting limbs protruding from the soft clay. While I didn't know their names or their histories, I knew precisely who they were, for they were garbed in a manner most familiar. In the lurid orange jumpsuits that was the distinct uniform of the prisoners of Old Andrea Correctional Facility. I dwelt in that watery tomb for a time I don't readily recall. Days passed by unaccounted for, blurring seamlessly into one another, and I lost myself to the inanity of it all. Try as I might, hunger soon overcame thirst. I filled my belly to bursting, until I could no longer stand the thought nor taste of water, but it never satisfied that primordial pang in my gut. I looked to the others, to the bodies scattered haphazardly around the place, to their puffy-fingered hands and wilting thighs, their sloughing skin.
Don't let them go to waste.
A fell voice whispered in my ear. No, I muttered out loud.
They won't feel a thing,
it urged. I shook my head frenziedly and plugged my ears with my fingers.
Eat,
it commanded. And I obeyed. The waterline had receded considerably in the days that followed, or had it been weeks? I wasn't sure. Having depleted all available stores of food, I was ready to move on. I had to. With renewed vigor, I plunged into waist-high water and waded through the opening. Spotting the railway, now submerged in the shallows, I inched, crawled, and hunched my way back along its length until I found myself at the entrance to the mine. In the flood, much of the debris had been swept away, or otherwise reduced to thick tracts of mud that came apart easily enough. I pulled back the soggy veil to find the bus gone, and crept squinting into the searing light of midday. The yard was as empty as the night I'd entered the mine, and the wire-rung gate left ajar. I made a beeline for the exit, breaking into a galloping run, fearing at all times I'd be shot down in a hail of gunfire. But no shot resounded through the quarry, and I cleared checkpoint after checkpoint without incident. I ran until I was breathless, and soon found myself roadside. A car was idling on the other side, and the driver waving frantically at me. I bolted across the street, and slipping in, we beat a hasty retreat. I watched with glee through the rearview window as the extensive fencing and security booth that demarcated the entrance to Old Andrea Correctional Facility faded from view, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished from sight. I sunk into the plush upholstery of the passenger seat and felt myself finally beginning to calm. A hand shot out to grasp my knee, and I turned to face the driver.
So, lovey, tell me all about your first term at the new school.